So my name is Benedict Rogers, or Ben Rogers, and I'm a human rights activist. I'm the founder and chair of Hong Kong Watch, and I work on human rights in other parts of Asia as well. How did I meet Luke de Pulford? I've known Luke for quite some years, I think maybe around 10 years, maybe more, and I met him through Lord Alton, who is one of Hong Kong Watch's patrons and who's a close friend of both mine and Luke's, and we got to know each other through Lord Alton, and I was delighted when Luke started to get involved in Hong Kong last year. What is Hong Kong Watch? It is a human rights advocacy organisation working to speak out for Hong Kong's freedoms, human rights, the rule of law, democracy, all the things that were promised to the people of Hong Kong before the handover and have been steadily eroded and denied in recent years. And so we do that through a combination of research, publishing reports on the situation in Hong Kong, reacting to events in Hong Kong through press releases and media activities, and advocacy in the British Parliament, the European Parliament, the United States Congress and other arenas around the world. And why did I start Hong Kong Watch? The idea well, first of all, I used to live in Hong Kong from 1997 to 2002. When I left Hong Kong in 2002, the situation was generally not bad. One country, two systems was maybe not perfect, but it was working reasonably well. And so I left Hong Kong, came back to the UK and was focused on other issues and was not really following the situation in Hong Kong. But when the umbrella movement happened in 2014, I realized something very fundamental was happening in Hong Kong. So I started to re-engage with what was happening in an individual capacity. I started to write about Hong Kong, to campaign. I hosted Joshua Wong and Nathan Law and Ansung Chan when they visited the UK, and I helped to arrange meetings for them. And there came a point when I was sitting in a taxi in a traffic jam in Surabaya in Indonesia. And if you know Surabaya at all, you know that traffic jams there give you a lot of thinking time because they're very long. And I was in this traffic jam thinking about what to do about Hong Kong. And I basically thought there is a need now for an organisation to advocate for Hong Kong. It was no longer enough for me on my own in my spare time. And so I texted a couple of friends who I knew were also interested. And I said, why don't we start an organisation? It was just before Joshua Wong, Nathan Law and Alex Chow were jailed in August 2017. And I started it because, as I say, I felt there was a need for an organisation to educate policymakers and parliamentarians to press for an international response to the challenges that Hong Kong was facing. What does the identity of a Hong Konger mean? I think for me what has become clear in the last year, really, as the movement has grown so significantly, is that Hong Kongers, of course not 100%, but a large proportion of Hong Kongers want their way of life protected, want freedom and democracy. And I see Hong Kong as the new front line in the fight for freedom. And so I say that I'm a Hong Konger partly because I used to live in Hong Kong. It was the city where I began my career. Sadly, it's a city that I'm currently no longer able to visit because I was denied entry in October 2017. But it's a city that I love, and I consider, it was my home for 5 years. But more importantly, I say I'm a Hong Konger because I share those values of democracy, freedom, human rights, which Hong Kongers are struggling for. And I think that they are fighting the new front line in the fight for freedom, not just for themselves, but actually for the rest of us as well. And if we lose Hong Kong, if it becomes just another mainland Chinese city, then I think those of us who value our own freedom are at risk. could you make my job easier? Well, first of all, I think Hong Kongers are doing an amazing thing. You are a constant source of inspiration to me. The fact that for 8 months now you have been continuing this movement in different ways, in mass protests, smaller protests, other activities, and you haven't given up, and that's incredibly inspiring. But I think that there is a danger. I hear some reports of a desire on the part of some of the protesters to adopt more radical actions, to escalate acts of violence. So far, I have been able to hold the line of saying that whilst I can't condone violence, I think we need to understand why some people have resorted to violence. It's been in response to the police violence. It was the police that started the violence, and it's an expression of desperation and frustration at the fact that the government doesn't listen. But I think Hong Kongers are at their strongest in terms of communicating to the rest of the world when they protest peacefully, and for example in the district council elections they gave such an overwhelming message through their votes. So I would encourage Hong Kongers to think twice about escalating the violence, because if it escalates, currently I can hold the line that I've described of saying that I don't condone it, but we need to understand it. But I think if it becomes more extreme violence, that will be impossible for the international community to ignore, and that will make our life in advocating for Hong Kong much more difficult. So that would be one message. I think another message would be, as much as possible, to be unified. I'm not suggesting that you form one movement or that you do away with the different groups in the movement. That would be impossible, and it wouldn't be desirable. But I think if the whole movement for democracy in Hong Kong can be a bit more united, that will make my work in speaking out for you easier. Do I think civil disobedience is more acceptable than violence? Yes, I do. I think actions like a general strike, like when, for example, the medical professionals went on strike in protest at Carrie Lam's refusal to close the border, and other forms of strikes, I think those are powerful, and as long as they're used strategically and sparingly, it can send a very powerful message, and if it's without violence, that's much better. So yes, I support civil disobedience if it's done in the right way, in a strategic way. What suggestions do I have for the protesters to be more united? Well, when I said that I would like to see greater unity, of course I am very impressed by the fact that the movement has so much support from Hong Kong people, and that Hong Kong people have not turned against the movement, even when there's been violence or other actions that they might not condone. And that was very clear in the district council elections. Hong Kong people spoke so overwhelmingly in that election. So I think there is a lot of unity already, but I'm concerned by, for example, the differences between the frontline protesters, the more traditional pan-democrats, also the localists, and differences between generations as well. And there appears to be a lack of willingness to communicate, from what I've seen, between the current generation of Democrats, of pro-democracy campaigners, and the older, more established generation. And I think it doesn't mean you have to agree with each other, and you may take different strategies and different approaches, but I think more communication between the different factions, basically between everyone who believes in democracy and who's fighting for democracy, I think you're only going to achieve or only going to make progress towards achieving your goal if more and more you can speak with one voice, both to the Hong Kong government and to the international community. What is my message to Hong Kong people fighting for democracy? My message is first and foremost that I am 100% with you, and I want to do everything that I can to support you, to strengthen you, to speak out for you. And I see this as not your fight that I, thousands of miles away, am kind of observing and supporting. I see it as our fight together. Of course, you, the Hong Kong people, are fighting on the front line and risking your lives, but I feel very committed to this fight with you. And I will continue to do everything I can from outside Hong Kong to advocate and to speak and to help the world see the importance of Hong Kong. I'm extremely disappointed as a British citizen that the British government has not done more. I think Britain in particular has a moral and legal responsibility to Hong Kong. It has a moral responsibility because of our history together, but it has a legal responsibility under the terms of the Sino-British Joint Declaration. And I think there's much more the British government can and should do. I think the British government, for example, should be looking at imposing Magnitsky sanctions against those responsible for human rights violations. I think we should be looking at better protection for British national overseas passport holders and others. I think BNO is a starting point. We should also be looking at the younger generation who are very vulnerable, who may need a place of sanctuary, but who may not have BNO passports. But we need to start with our obligations to BNOs. I think we should also be speaking out much more vocally in international arena. And so part of my message to Hong Kongers is I will do everything I can to get the British government to live up to its responsibilities, and other governments as well. But if the British government still fails to do its duty to Hong Kong, at least I will try to do my duty to Hong Kong. What are the difficulties in lobbying UK government and officials? I think the biggest difficulty is, in my view, a misplaced fear of the power of China. I say misplaced because I personally think that China is not the big economic beneficiary to the UK that people think that it is, but also that other examples show that when you do stand up to China, it doesn't necessarily affect trade. Germany's Chancellor Angela Merkel has, over the years, consistently been pretty outspoken on human rights in China, not so much for Hong Kong, but human rights in China, and yet Germany remains China's biggest trading partner. So there's a bit of a myth that if you want to do trade with China, you have to kowtow and be silent on human rights. I think that's not the case, and we should be speaking out more. I also think that actually China respects you more when you do stand out for your values. When Xi Jinping came to London on a state visit a few years ago, there was an American businessman who lives in Shanghai who was interviewed on BBC Radio, and he was very critical of the British government's approach to Xi Jinping and said that Britain should be more robust in standing up for our values. And he said, he used a phrase which has stayed with me ever since. He said, if you act like a panting puppy, China will think that they have you on a leash. Whereas if you actually stand up to them, they might not like it, but they will have more respect for you. And so I think we in Britain need to rediscover respect for our values and stand up for our values and for the values of people in Hong Kong, and be bolder in standing up to China and not kowtowing to them. What is my message to the UK public? My message to the UK public is Hong Kong really matters. Hong Kong matters because we as a country have a historic moral responsibility to Hong Kong. But it matters also, as I've already said, because it is the new front line in the fight for freedom. And if Hong Kong loses its freedoms, we will see an emboldened China continue to threaten freedom around the world, and that includes our own freedoms. So it's not only a moral responsibility to stand up for Hong Kong, it's actually in our own interests to defend the values that we in the UK take for granted of freedom, human rights, the rule of law, democracy, and to defend them for the people on the front line in Hong Kong. What are the repercussions of the deal between the Vatican and China? Well, I'm very concerned about this deal. I think that the Vatican has made a big mistake, because I think the Vatican's intention was to improve protection for the freedom of Catholics and for others in China. But in reality, the reverse is the case. Hong Kong's Cardinal Zen, who's a big hero of mine, and I have the privilege of knowing him a little bit, he said recently that the Vatican has lost everything in this deal. We've seen over the last 18 months that persecution of Catholics and of other religious minorities has, if anything, increased and worsened and intensified. And I think that's going to continue. So my message to the Vatican is exactly the same as my message to the British government. Don't kowtow to the Chinese Communist Party. Stand up for your values. And I hope the Vatican will rethink its approach. I would also add that I want to distinguish between China and the Chinese Communist Party. I am not at all anti-China. In fact, I've spent much of my adult life in and around China. I have many Chinese friends. I love China. It's the Chinese Communist Party that I'm talking about when I say that it's a threat to us and our values. And I think it's really important to distinguish between those, because the Chinese regime will often say if you're a critic of the CCP, you're anti-China, and that's not the case for me. So with Huawei and other Chinese investment in Britain, are we giving away or selling away our freedom? Yes, I think we are. I think we are in real danger, particularly with Huawei's investment in 5G. I've been quite outspoken on it, and I have real concerns that it is sooner or later a threat to our national security, also to our personal freedom and privacy. I think it's also incredible that we have ignored the not just the advice but the pressure of two of our closest allies and friends, the United States and Australia, and to put a deal with a company that is closely associated with the Chinese Communist Party ahead of our relationships with the United States and Australia seems extraordinary to me. And I also think we're compromising our values when it is known, and it's been proven by an Australian think tank in particular, that Huawei is complicit with serious human rights violations in Xinjiang in particular. It's been helping the Chinese Communist Party build the world's largest surveillance state. And so to be inviting such a company into our national infrastructure is, I think, very dangerous. And then with the talk of other investments, HS2 and others, I think we are in serious danger of, we've left the European Union, and those who advocated leaving the European Union talked about taking back control. But as Tom Tugendhat, the chair of the Foreign Affairs Committee in Parliament, has said, are we taking back control from Brussels only to give it away or sell it away to Beijing? And I think we're in danger of doing that, and I'm very concerned about it. What do I think about the Chinese style of governing in relation to the coronavirus? I think the Chinese Communist Party and the Chinese regime is part of the problem of the coronavirus, not part of the solution to the virus. If China had an open, transparent and accountable form of governance, the virus would have been, action would have been taken to address the virus at a much earlier stage. As it was, whistleblowers who were warning about the virus at early stages came under pressure from the police and the authorities to be silent. They were threatened, they were repressed, and as a consequence, of course, one doctor, the famous whistleblower, then contracted the virus and very tragically died. And I think, I'm not saying that a democratic system would be perfect. Democracies have their own problems, and democracies have public health crises at times, but it would be impossible to imagine a virus like this beginning and the government repressing the information about the virus and failing to deal with it. And that's what happened in the early stages in China. So I think the Chinese regime is not just a repressor of human rights, it's actually a danger to public health. Basically, as you say, I flew from London to Bangkok. I was in Bangkok for other reasons, for a conference there. And then what was interesting was that 2 days before I was due to go to Hong Kong, I received a telephone call from a British MP who I know very well, who's basically friendly towards me, but who also had communication with the Chinese embassy. And he called me to say that the Chinese embassy had called him and had said that they knew that I was planning to go to Hong Kong. They were very angry and they wanted him to tell me not to go. And he said, I want to make it clear, I'm not telling you not to go, I'm just telling you that, you know, that they know. Anyway, I took advice from people in Hong Kong and also various political people in the UK. And everybody said to me, you should still go, because they thought, firstly, that Hong Kong's autonomy was still strong enough that it would be Hong Kong immigration making the decision and that Hong Kong immigration would let me in. But they said, if in the unlikely event that Beijing, you know, insists that I denied entry, the world needs to know, because at that time, nobody, to my knowledge, or very few, certainly no Westerner, I think, had been denied entry. Obviously, since then, there have been a number of cases, but I was kind of the guinea pig. And their point was, the world needs to know this, because this is another violation of Hong Kong's autonomy. But the only way to know is the only way to find out is to go. And I agreed with that, and so I went, thinking that the likelihood is I'll get in. But as it turned out, they were more serious than I'd expected. What do I think about the harassment of Hong Kongers and public figures in the UK? I think it's very concerning because the UK is a country that values freedom of expression, basic human rights, and to have people apparently on behalf of the Chinese Communist Party trying to silence people in the UK is a threat to everything that this country values. So I'm aware of quite a number of cases of Hong Kong students in universities around the UK who've come under sometimes physical intimidation and threat from mainland Chinese students. There's a case recently of a student union official in Sheffield making comments that were directly threatening Hong Kongers, and I know individuals who've received physical threats. But then even I myself, over the last 2 years, I've received, I've lost count now, but 20 or 30 letters that have come to my home address, which is not publicly, very, very readily available, Some of these letters went to my neighbours. The first letter that came had my picture on it, and it went to my entire neighbourhood, or all my street, and my picture and the words "Watch him" underneath. My mother, who lives in a different part of the country, has also received several letters telling her to tell her son to stop speaking out. I've received numerous emails, some emails threatening me, but some emails impersonating me to other people, in obviously an attempt to try to discredit me. Luke de Pulford has had similar things, but also I've had at least 3 or 4 British members of Parliament, different members of Parliament, telling me that they have been lobbied and pressured by the Chinese embassy in London to tell me to shut up. So there does appear to be a really concerted effort to pressure critics of the CCP, and I think that's a direct threat to our freedoms here, and we need to stand up and say that it's not acceptable.